Hi, my name is Ashley Oswald, and today we'll be talking about translanguaging tough topics, using translanguaging and tough topics to promote equity and inclusion in the multilingual classroom. First, we will look at tough topics. What are they and why should we teach them? Then we'll look at translanguaging and also examine what is it and why should we be doing it. Then we will look at the research and some of its implications for the use of translanguaging to increase access to content such as tough topics. And then finally, we'll finish by looking at some teaching tips so that you come away from this video with some concrete ideas on how to implement the use of translanguaging for teaching tough topics in your classroom. Why do we want to teach tough topics? And I don't mean academically tough. Dr. Larry Schwartz, in his book called Teaching Tough Topics, describes tough topics as those that might make teachers feel uncomfortable or maybe ill-prepared, topics that might cause students to reveal stories that we don't know how to respond to, topics that might trigger intense emotions or cause arguments, and topics that just in general also fall outside of our mandated curriculum. One quote from his book which really resonated with me was this: "We live in a challenging world where we are called upon to respect and tolerate views different than our own." So as teachers, through teaching tough topics, we can be bringing the real world into the classroom. And we want to do this primarily because we want to create kind and compassionate and caring citizens of this world. And because we want to promote tolerance and kindness in all of our students and in our classrooms, our school, and our community. And finally, teaching tough topics can also allow us to respond more appropriately to any of the sensitive events that can happen in our students' lives, in our school, in our community, or even the world. So when we think about teaching tough topics, we want to reflect on the representation that is happening in the literature that we are using with students. Do students see themselves reflected in the characters, how they look, how they speak, how they behave, the families that are depicted in the stories that we read, and the challenges that characters experience? These are just a few of the questions that we can be asking ourselves when we look at our book collections. Students can learn about other people, but they can also learn about themselves. So whether or not they are similar to a character in a book or not, regardless, they are learning about themselves in relation to the world. Students who aren't represented in the literature that we show in the classroom can feel invisible, but students who are represented can feel empowered and proud. So how do we want our students to feel in our classrooms? I think the answer is pretty clear. Sharing diverse perspectives and experiences is one way that teachers can be culturally responsive. But what does it mean to be culturally responsive? Being culturally responsive means that we are teaching in a way that acknowledges the diversity of our students, their experiences, their heritage, their religions, their practices, their identities. We are also trying to make meaningful connections between school and home. And we are also trying to make learning accessible to all students. I think most teachers can appreciate and understand that teaching tough topics is very important. However, in the context of a multilingual classroom, such as French immersion, this can be particularly challenging. Tough topics are tough because they are complex. Students want to be able to share their experiences, they want to ask questions, and they will often ask deep questions that are difficult to answer in any language. So having this additional language barrier can make teaching tough topics feel especially tough in the second language classroom. So what is the solution? How can we be teaching tough topics at the level that we should be, while at the same time making sure that that is accessible to all of our learners regardless of their level of language proficiency? So how can we be culturally responsive in two ways, in that we are teaching tough topics and that we are doing so in a way that we are providing access to all learners in our classroom? This brings us to translanguaging. What is it? In order to understand translanguaging, it's also important to understand its competing principle, the monolingual principle. The monolingual principle is one of language separation, while translanguaging is an idea of language mixing. The monolingual principle involves exclusive use of the target language, meaning you are never speaking a single word of English to your class if you are a French immersion teacher. The monolingual principle began at the beginning of the 19th century, making it over 100 years old. The first language is actually viewed as a problem, and there is this belief that the use of the first language hinders the learning of the second language. And so teacher perception of the first language is also negative. So when teachers might hear students speaking in the first language, they might immediately be on them, telling them, you need to be speaking in French or you need to be speaking in English. On the other side of the coin, we have translanguaging, which again is language mixing. And this came from a Welsh term that I do not know how to pronounce. However, what it means is that we're providing input still in the target language, and we might expect output in the first language. This was the original meaning of the term. There's been a lot of research about translanguaging, and it's been shown to be an extremely natural process for bilingual learners. Translanguaging views the first language as a resource, so it validates translation as well as a cognitively complex skill. It also includes the idea of code switching, which is sort of fluidly switching back and forth between both languages. In Young's research, the monolingual principle is associated with this idea of sink or swim. Toss the student into this ocean of language, and we expect them to sink or swim. If they sink, it's, too bad, so sad for them. But what if there was another option between sinking and swimming independently right away? What if you could give your students a flotation device? What if they could use this flotation device in the beginning of their learning to help them learn how to swim and keep them afloat until they are able to do it independently? Do we want to be submerging our students in the target language? A synonym to submerge would be to engulf. Or do we want to immerse them, which means to surround or dip them into the language at the beginning of their journey? I'm not sure about you, but I certainly am a French immersion teacher and not a French submersion teacher. This flotation device that I'm referring to is essentially translanguaging. It can be used as a strategy to support learners during their early stages of acquiring a second language. There is so much research showing that there are disadvantages to only allowing the target language, and there are a ton of advantages to allowing translanguaging. In a monolingual classroom, students are frequently silenced and feel disempowered and confused. They might be positioned as incompetent, and they are also deprived of this important social and cognitive tool, which is language and communicating with their peers. They may be unable to access other curricular content, and they can experience lower self-confidence and well-being. One student in Young's study was quoted saying, "I felt virtually useless, and I didn't feel like someone who was a part of the class." Is this how we want our students to feel? I don't think so. In translanguaging classrooms, where both the first language and the second language are used, students who are struggling with acquisition of the second language are still included and empowered, and they still have a voice. They are positioned as competent bilinguals. Students are able to participate and share their ideas, as well as interact with one another socially and make friends. They are also much better able to access curricular content, such as tough topics. One quote that I came across in my research, which is just amazing, is this one. "Translanguaging liberates the voices of emerging bilinguals." This is so powerful, and I hope that it sticks with you after this presentation. So what is some of the research on translanguaging and how it can be used to facilitate the teaching of tough topics? In my research, I identified 4 main areas where translanguaging can help. First, in increasing engagement. Second, increasing learning. Third, in helping students make connections. And fourth, by helping to get families involved in student learning, which we know improves their learning and their experiences at school. So with translanguaging, we are viewing the use of the first and second language as the use of their entire linguistic repertoire. This is a very common phrase that I've seen in the research. And by using this entire repertoire, they can engage in literacy in ways that will help deepen their understanding of texts. And also a lot of rich conversations can happen as a result. There was a really interesting study done in Quebec by Leicester et al. In 2009, where French immersion students read chapter books, Magic Treehouse books, in both French and in English. And the study said that it generated high levels of motivation and that their interest in continuing to read these types of books afterwards was striking. Here you also see some diagrams from a study by Salmona in 2014, which looked at how participation and disruptions were influenced by the use of translanguaging. Activity A was a monolingual activity where there was only a read aloud done in the target language, and activity B was a read aloud done using translanguaging. So on the left, we have an image of activity A showing that the amount of participation and the amount of interruptions are quite similar. But on the right, we also have activity B showing that participation increased drastically and disruptions decreased drastically through the use of translanguaging. So it's very clear just by looking at these two graphs which read aloud, the monolingual read aloud or the translanguaging read aloud, was more engaging and which one prompted students to participate more. Secondly, research shows that translanguaging results in more learning. Why does this happen? Well, we can look at two really commonly used models in the fields of learning and the fields of language acquisition. On the left, I have the terms used in Vygotsky's zone of proximal development model, and on the right, I have the words used in Krashen's input hypothesis and comprehensible input model. Krashen specifically works in the realm of second language acquisition, but their models, if you Google image search their models, they will both come up with a visual which is similar like this, where on the bottom, we have a small circle. For Vygotsky, he would say that this is what a student can do by themselves, and Krashen would say this is their current level of language proficiency. So again, what they can do by themselves. The biggest circle, the white one here, is what Krashen would see as language that is too challenging, and what Vygotsky would say is what the student or the learner cannot do yet. So we have the small circle, which is what they can do alone, and the white circle, which is what they cannot do at all. In the middle, we have this light blue circle, which is what Krashen would refer to as comprehensible input, and what Vygotsky would refer to as what a student or learner can do with help. The beautiful thing about translanguaging is that it's actually increasing this zone of proximal development, and it's increasing comprehensible input for a student. So if we looked back at the diagrams from before to activity A versus activity B, in activity A, when the read aloud was a monolingual read aloud, for many students, that input was not comprehensible and it was too challenging. It was beyond their zone of proximal development. But by introducing translanguaging, suddenly the same book becomes comprehensible and it becomes something that the student can understand and learn from. So this beautiful light blue zone of what the student can do with help or comprehensible input is where learning is going to happen. So by using translanguaging, we can still maintain access to these types of topics and these types of text and still ensure that it's comprehensible and that the student is able to actually understand and learn something. Additionally, translanguaging helps prevent teachers from paraphrasing or shortening text to make them comprehensible. I know that many teachers do this. I myself have done this as well. You're reading a French book out loud to your class, but the vocabulary is super advanced beyond the level of your students, so you just simplify it. But what if instead of simplifying, you read it as is and then also added in some strategic uses of the first language to help students access that complex content? Paraphrasing can often eliminate important features of a text, whereas translanguaging allows us to still keep that complexity, but just build students' access to it and make that input more comprehensible. Additionally, translanguaging allows students to make much deeper connections in many ways. First of all, with the language itself. When we use both languages, students in their learning of the target language are able to connect the target language to their first language and actually understand the target language more deeply through their similarities or their differences. This was something new for me that I found in my research. Memory retrieval specifically is actually linked with language. So if you experienced something in English, whether it was a dream, whether it was someone talking to you, or whether it was even just you talking to yourself, your inner self-talk was happening in English, Later on, if you were engaged in a conversation in another language, it would be more difficult for you to retrieve that memory quickly and clearly and in detail if you were trying to explain it in another language. But if you were thinking about that memory in English and expressing yourself and your recollection of that memory in English, it would be much easier for you to recall this memory and retrieve it because you're currently using the same language that it was encoded in. Isn't this fascinating? Finally, it also helps students to build connections with themselves. When students are using all of their languages to engage with a text, they are truly bringing their entire selves, their language, their emotions, their bodies, their memories, as we already discussed, and their lives into the text. Research has consistently shown that consistency between literacy practices at home and literacy practices at school can raise student achievement, which is what we all want to do. However, there's often a gap in this area, and translanguaging is one way that we can close the gap. When we use translanguaging, first of all, we are recognizing the cultural and linguistic richness that is already happening at home. We're viewing the language they speak at home as valid and competent and something that belongs in our classroom. There was a study done by Perry et al. In 2008 where they sent home bags for families that had English books and Spanish books in them. And most of the families said that they alternated between both languages when engaging with either text. So whether they were reading an English book or a Spanish book, they alternated between languages to aid in either the parent's comprehension or the child's comprehension of the text. And this was occurring naturally without any instruction to do so. It also helps families feel happy, visible, and included when they're able to share a text with their child that they are reading at school, and they can also read it at home together. So what is my implication here? Essentially, that translanguage can be used to help students engage with, learn from, and connect to tough topics, and also share this learning meaningfully with their families at home. So let's talk about some teaching tips. First of all, I highly recommend the use of beginner bilingual books if you teach very emergent learners. Two that I like to use at the start of the year are The Fabulous, Lost and Found, and The Little Mouse Who Spoke, and in my case, The Little Mouse Who Spoke French, or Lingo the Dingo by Mark Pallis, and they've been translated into so many different languages. So there is The Little Mouse Who Spoke Italian, The Little Mouse Who Spoke Arabic, The Little Mouse Who Spoke German, The Little Mouse Who Spoke Chinese. And essentially, it tells a story of a little mouse who shows up at a lost and found, and he's looking for something, except he speaks another language. And so the book is written in English and whatever this other language is, and it shows their interaction and how they come to find each other, and it's actually also quite funny and cute. Also, we have Lingo the Dingo, who likes to help people, but the people who he comes across that he wants to help also don't speak his language. So right now there are two, Lingo the Dingo and the French chef or the Italian chef, and then Lingo the Dingo and the astronaut. So maybe the Chinese astronaut or the Portuguese astronaut. And so he wants to help these people, but he doesn't speak their language. He does a little bit because he's just learning. So the book mixes English and the target language in a really engaging way for students. Next, I want to talk about two of my favorite resources, and these are multilingual digital books. So first we have Storybooks Canada. Storybooks Canada is one of my favorite resources of all time. It includes around 40 African storybooks, and they have been translated into, I believe, 30 different languages. So of course they're available in English and French, but they're also available in a wide variety of other languages that are most commonly spoken by immigrants and refugees to Canada. I love to use Storybooks Canada because I can use them in my classroom, especially for independent reading centers, because the students can listen to the stories in French regardless of their French ability. But they're also then able to listen to the same sentence in English if they didn't understand, and when they bring the story home, they can listen in their first language. So many of my students listen to whichever story we're working on that week at home with their families. And this can enable them to build connections between English, French, and the language they speak at home. And they also get to enjoy sharing these books with their families. And I've received a lot of really positive feedback from families about it. We also have Indigenous storybooks, which I do believe is going to end up being very similar to Storybooks Canada. It's also a part of the Global Storybooks Project. So these stories are not all, but many of them come from an Indigenous perspective. There's around 12 available right now that have been translated into English, French, and Spanish. They are also planning to translate these books, I believe, into the same immigrant and refugee languages that are most commonly spoken in Canada, but they are also available in Indigenous languages such as Halkomelem. What if you just want to read a book to your class and you want to read an amazing book about a tough topic and you want to know how can I use translanguaging during this read aloud to help my students access the text and be able to respond to it? There's two really good strategies that I've come across in my research. The first one being repeat and affirm. So essentially, this is a very easy to use strategy. You're reading a text primarily in the target language, and you might ask students to complete a sentence, or you might ask them a question, and you are going to allow them to answer in the target language or their first language. And you're going to, if the answer is correct, affirm yes, and then repeat their answer in the target language. So in this way, you are building their feelings of competence that yes, you've got the correct answer. You're validating their language use of some kind, because especially with primary students, their use of language to answer your question is a big win. And then you're also continuing to develop their language skills by repeating their answer in the target language. Second, really excellent strategy is adding extra information. So Kelly from The Reading Teacher advocates for, rather than translating word for word, adding additional information to help them understand without translating. There is still lots of research that validates translation as well as a cognitively challenging task, and one that is actually helpful for the development of language skills. Jim Cummins from U of T is a big advocate of using translation as a part of translanguaging. But I know that a lot of French immersion teachers don't believe in the use of translation. So I'm here to tell you that if you don't want to translate, that doesn't mean you can't translanguage. So instead of translating, you can just add extra information. You can repeat the sentence in a different way. You can add a little bit of context. You can also pose questions, visuals, do gestures, and model your own thinking through translanguaging. A final tip is to film interactive translanguaging read alouds, but I also really recommend enlisting help from the community. Of course, you can film your own translanguaging read alouds so that you can provide a link for parents to use at home and listen to the story with their families if they speak English. Again, make sure you're sharing these links privately, because I am not qualified to give you legal advice on the recording of a book and the sharing of it publicly. However, if you share it privately, you can record your own read alouds of books using your target language and the first language if you share it. However, you may have a lot of students that have a first language that you don't speak. And so in this case, I really recommend enlisting help from your community. So you can try and find other educators, parents, or other members of the community that are willing to record translanguaging versions of these texts in these various home languages. But again, ensure that you are sharing these legally with your school community. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this so helpful. At the very least, I hope that you will come away remembering this quote, which is that translanguaging liberates the voices of emergent bilinguals. So please give it a try, liberate the voices of your students in French immersion, and see what magic happens.